Hi everyone. In this video we're going to give you a short simple repertoire for black against the King's Gambit, which is the opening e4, e5, f4. Okay, our antidote to the King's Gambit is the move d5, counterattack in the center. Now we'll look at 5 different responses here. Let's get out of the way some bad ones like f takes e5. Okay, if you see that move, you are going to win the game with queen to h4 check, g3, queen takes e4, forking the king and the rook. Okay, another move we'll get out of the way quickly is the move knight to f3. In this case, we'll play e takes f4, white will capture on d5, and we'll move knight to f6. And this transposed to the main line, which we will take a look at in a moment. Okay, another move we'll get out of the way is knight to c3. If you see that move, we will play knight to f6, and this has transposed to the Vienna game, the Vienna Gambit, and that's covered in another video in our repertoire. Okay, another move you might see here is the move d4. Now d4 is a slight mistake, and there are a couple ways to take advantage of it. We're going to take the pawn on f4 with a threat to play queen to h4 check. So white will likely capture the pawn with the bishop to stop that threat, and then we'll take the pawn on e4, and we'll try to stay a pawn up for as long as we can. We do have to catch up in development. For example, white might play knight to c3 to attack our pawn. We'll play knight to f6 to defend it. Maybe bishop to c4, and we'll play bishop to d6 to oppose his bishop and get ready to castle kingside. So we do have to speed up our development there. Okay, so let's get to the main line. All right, so after this move d5, 90% of the time you're going to see this position arise after e takes d5. We're going to take the pawn on f4 and then knight to f3. And we saw this same position earlier with a different move order where knight to f3 was played first before the exchange of pawns. I'll mention one quick sideline. Instead of knight to f3, white might play bishop to c4 to defend that pawn. And that just gives us this check here on h4, displacing his king. And after that, we'll play bishop to d6 to protect that f4 pawn. Often in this variation of the King's Gambit, you want to bolster this f4 pawn for as long as you can. It does disorganize his development, makes it hard to work around that pawn. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to stay up a pawn forever. You might have to return it eventually, but often you do keep your eye on that pawn for as long as you can. White will probably play knight to f3 to kick our queen, and we'll post it on h5, and we're doing well in this position, and we'll stop that line there. But back to the main line, which is this move knight to f3. Okay, after knight f3, we'll play knight f6 to attack the d5 pawn. We don't want to capture it with the queen and lose a tempo. We want to get developed in a hurry here with knight to f6. And now we'll consider 4 responses. First, let's consider bishop to b5 check, which is not the main line. We'll get to the main line last. Well, c6 will block the check. D takes c6, and we'll take back with the knight in order to develop quickly. You can expect d4 here so that the dark square bishop is hitting your f pawn. And we'll play bishop to d6 to protect it. And we'll stop the analysis here, but we'll mention a blunder that white sometimes makes. You might see a player attack the pinned knight with d5. Well, in that case, you can simply take the pawn, and you don't have to fear losing your knight because bishop to b4 reveals an attack on the queen, and white has lost the game. Okay, so backing up, Another move after knight f6 that is sometimes played is knight to c3 to defend the d5 pawn. So we'll take it, he'll take back, draw our queen out to the middle of the board. Again, d4 is a normal move, expanding in the center and attacking the f4 pawn. Now, we don't have to defend it. We can play bishop to e7 to block the e-file and get ready to castle, because bishop takes f4 here loses a piece to queen to e4 check. Okay, c4 to harass our queen and gain space, and we'll play queen to d6 to hold on to that f-pawn. Again, for as long as we can, we might lose it later on. Okay, so let's look at another alternative here for white. So after knight f6, another move that's sometimes played is c4. And this seems to be aggressive, saying, I'm going to hang on to this pawn no matter what. Well, that's okay. We're going to gambit a pawn. Remember, we are up this pawn over here. So we're going to play c3 to break up that pawn formation, or c6 rather. And we'll consider two moves here, starting with d takes c6. We'll recapture with the knight, of course. And then d4, again, hits the f-pawn with the dark square bishop. But we can disrupt his development with bishop to b4 check, knight c3, and knight e4 attacking that pinned knight, bishop to d2 to unpin it. And this is a threat to win our knight on e4. Turns out the best move in this position is to ignore the threat and castle, because if he takes the knight, we'll play rook to e8, pinning the knight, and we're going to win our piece back, and the position favors black. Okay, going back here after c6, white might not take on c6, allowing our knight to get into the game. He may play d4 instead. In that case, we'll again play bishop to b4 check, knight c3. This time, knight to e4 to attack that pinned knight is not as successful for black, because black hasn't gotten this knight out into the game yet. So we're going to take the pawn on d5. You can expect bishop takes f4 in return. We'll castle, and then he'll probably develop his light squared bishop to get ready to castle. And at that point, we'll take on c4. And if he takes back with the bishop, then he will have lost a tempo. Okay, so those are the alternatives to the main line in this position. The main line continues bishop to c4. After bishop c4, we take the pawn on d5. Two moves we'll look at here. First, if white captures on d5, we'll take back, of course. Knight to c3 hits the queen. And there are a lot of squares we could put that queen on, but we'll favor f5 simply to protect our f4 pawn. And we're safe on the f5 square. We'll end this line here because it looks like black can easily get developed and castled, and he's fine. All right, but back to the main line. After our knight captures on d5, the main line continues castles. And then bishop to e6 blocks the e-file from any checks. And there's a threat on the c4 bishop, because if we remove our knight, for example, knight to e3, we can attack the queen and the bishop simultaneously. Okay, so most players will drop that bishop back to b3 to defend it. And now we will play c5. That's an important move to remember to control this central d4 square. So if white ever plays d4, we can exchange pawns. That's much better than something like knight to c6, because this pawn can come with tempo and the other pawn can come forward and threaten a fork here. And it's better to stop those pawns to begin with by putting this on c5. And that's the end of our analysis for the main line. Thanks for watching the video.